The vastness of space stretched endlessly before the Imperial conquerors, their fleet a dark and imposing shadow against the glittering backdrop of distant stars. Countless ships gleaming, cold, and perfectly arranged moved together like a single, unyielding force. These were the weapons of an empire that had swept across the galaxies, devouring worlds, erasing civilizations, and shattering the very fabric of life. Each ship was a symbol of their might, a testament to 1,000 years of relentless conquest. In the heart of this mighty fleet stood Siren Vorex, the Emperor, his presence as colossal as the empire he commanded. Towering over his officers, his dark eyes gleamed with the confidence of a ruler who had never been challenged. The command room buzzed with a sense of finality, the air thick with the anticipation of another victory. His fleet, vast and invincible, was on the cusp of annihilating yet another world, another people. The target? Humanity. Vorex's voice broke the silence, deep and resonating, filling the room with the weight of command. We have sent our ultimatum. Surrender or perish, he said, his tone absolute. His officers, standing rigidly around him, nodded in solemn agreement, their faces cold with the certainty of their supremacy. These humans, they are nothing, one officer murmured, his voice laced with disdain. Vorex's lips curled into a thin smile. Indeed. No one has ever dared to resist us. Humanity will be no different. But as the fleet drew closer to the edge of human space, something unexpected unfolded. A strange message flickered across their sensors. Instead of the usual desperate pleas for mercy or frantic attempts at negotiation, the humans sent a single, simple transmission. One brief acknowledgement. No threats. No cries for help. For a moment, the room was silent, the officers exchanging confused glances. Vorex's expression shifted from one of anticipation to disbelief, then to disdain. His lips parted, the slightest hint of a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth as he scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. Just one ship, he muttered under his breath, barely able to contain his amusement. They think one vessel can stop us. The Emperor chuckled softly, the sound low and mocking. The enormity of their fleet, the sheer power of the Imperial conquerors, seemed so beyond what any single ship could ever challenge. And yet, here they were, faced with a species so foolish, so naive, that they sent only a single ship as their defense. Vorex turned to his officers, his eyes narrowing, as if daring them to suggest that the humans were anything more than a fleeting threat. The entire room buzzed with suppressed laughter, the very idea of a single human ship defying the might of the fleet too ridiculous to comprehend. They are either mad or simply ignorant, Vorex said, his voice cutting through the tension. Either way, they will fall. But deep inside him, a flicker of doubt began to form. It was subtle, buried beneath his confidence, but it was there. He had seen many species cower before the might of the conquerors, but humanity, what was it about them that made this moment feel different? As Vorex dismissed the transmission, the fleet moved forward, engines roaring as they sliced through the cold silence of space, drawing ever closer to their prey. They would show the humans their place in the galaxy. They would show them the price of defiance. But in the quiet of the command room, a single thought lingered: what if they were underestimating humanity? As the fleet advanced, the vastness of the galaxy seemed to stretch in all directions, an endless expanse of stars. Yet in that silence, there was a strange feeling that someone was watching. The Imperial fleet descended upon the first human colony with all the inevitability of a storm. Vast ships, their hulls like looming mountains, cut through the darkness of space, their engines humming with the promise of conquest. The colony, nestled on a small planet, was nothing more than a dot in the endless void, but to the Imperial conquerors, it was yet another insignificant world to crush beneath their boot. Expecting swift and unquestioning surrender, the fleet's commanders felt a rush of anticipation. The humans, like so many before them, would bow to the might of the Empire. The ultimatum had been delivered. Resistance was futile. But as the fleet arrived, the hum of the engines faltered in the minds of the Imperial officers, the first signs of hesitation creeping in as they observed the strange, unexpected movements of the humans below. The first sign of defiance was subtle, a single flash of light. A primitive railgun shot fired from the surface, its trajectory too erratic, too raw to be taken seriously by the Imperial ships. But it did strike. Not in any vital spot, but enough to rattle the sensors of the nearest dreadnought. The weapons were crude, barely a whisper against the terror of Imperial firepower, but they hit. It was only then that the fleet began to take notice. The planet's surface was teeming with resistance. The humans had no shields, no sophisticated weaponry like the Imperial ships possessed. They had only their grit, their resolve, and their raw determination to fight. The Imperial officers watched in disbelief as humans scurried from bunker to bunker, using nuclear warheads, simple yet powerful enough to strike at the heart of their war machines. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the fleet, the blast echoing across the void like a heartbeat. The humans were not surrendering. They fought with everything they had, with every ounce of desperation. The railguns, primitive as they were, tore into the hulls of Imperial ships, leaving dents and scars. It was nothing like the efficiency of Imperial weapons, but it was enough to cause damage. Enough to buy time. The Imperial fleet's commanders grew silent as they observed the struggle below. The colony, despite the relentless firepower of the Empire, held on just for a little longer. It should have fallen in hours, like every other world before it. But the humans held firm, defying the expectations of every officer who stood at the helm of their battleships. "They shouldn't have this power," whispered General Raku's Thrill, his voice low, barely audible in the eerie calm that had settled over the command center. His eyes were wide, studying the images before him, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been taught about the humans. Their technology, it's not supposed to be this advanced. The words seemed to hang in the air, the weight of them settling heavily in the room. The humans were supposed to be no more than a primitive species, isolated, unequipped to face the might of the Imperial fleet. But what they were witnessing now, the resistance that was happening on the ground, was far more than anyone had anticipated. It was as if the humans had somehow bridged the vast gap between their primitive technologies and the Empire's power in ways that made no sense. How could this be? The fleet commander, Admiral Kurandrak, paced nervously, his sharp gaze never leaving the holographic display. "This cannot be," he muttered under his breath, pacing from one side of the room to the other. "Their technology was never meant to challenge us." But it was. And it did. It was the first hint of something deeply unsettling, a force the Empire had never encountered before. Something raw, untamed, and terrifying. The humans were fighting back in ways that had no place in their understanding of war. Their defense wasn't calculated or sophisticated, it was primal, instinctual, and it struck with a fury that burned through the cold calculation of the Imperial war machines. The fleet's bombardment continued, the weapons of mass destruction unleashed in a relentless wave. The first colony, despite its strength and the sheer tenacity of its defenders, finally fell. But the Imperial fleet was left with an uneasy feeling, a gnawing suspicion that the next world would not fall so easily. For the second colony was not the same. The fight would last longer. The resistance would be fiercer. The humans, it seemed, had learned from the first battle, their tactics evolving. They were adapting, finding new ways to strike at the heart of the Imperial fleet, attacking not just with weapons, but with an unyielding spirit that could not be measured. And as the second colony fell, slower this time, The Imperial officers began to understand, this wasn't a battle of weapons. It was a battle of wills. And the humans were winning. Despite the overwhelming force of the Empire, despite their centuries of technology and experience, they were being faced with something they had never expected. Something they could not control. And the question now was, how long could the Empire hold on before the humans took the fight to them? As the Imperial fleet drew closer to Earth, their ships cut through the silence of space like blades through cloth. Their commanders, confident in their overwhelming might, expected to find a planet broken, its people cowering in fear, desperate to submit. Humanity, in their eyes, was just another conquered race waiting to be wiped from existence. The planet that had once seemed so full of promise now felt like a forgotten footnote in the grand design of the Empire. The fleet surged forward, their dreadnoughts towering, gleaming with the cold arrogance of centuries of dominance. Admiral Drak, standing at the helm of the flagship, observed the spectacle unfolding on the screen before him. His mind was focused, confident, certain that this final push would be no different from any other conquest. The humans had no hope. They were nothing more than a speck on the map, destined to be erased. But then something peculiar happened. A single transmission flickered across their screens. It was brief, too simple to be taken seriously. One ship. No grand military display, no army waiting to greet them. Just one, solitary vessel, moving steadily toward the heart of their fleet. The officers in the command room exchanged confused glances, their laughter echoing around the walls. Admiral Drak, his voice thick with condescension, chuckled darkly. This is it? One ship? Against all of us? It will be a mere speck, nothing more. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. The arrogance of the humans was laughable. They hadn't even bothered to send a fleet. But the anticipation of victory grew heavy in the air. It was a victory already claimed. The human ship, insignificant in size compared to the vast Imperial warships, continued its journey toward the fleet with eerie calm. At first, there was nothing unusual about its course, its movement a simple act of defiance. The Imperial fleet didn't even bother to change formation. They laughed, certain that the single ship would be crushed before it could even come close. Then, as the ship drew closer to the heart of the Imperial fleet, something unexplainable occurred. It was subtle at first, just a slight disturbance in the air, like the faintest tremor. Admiral Drak stiffened, his smile faltering. Then, the shields of the Imperial fleet flickered. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a glitch, a minor malfunction, a momentary dip in energy. But the flicker spread, like a sickness crawling through the fleet. Systems began to fail. Not all at once, but in waves, subtle, growing. A ripple of unease spread through the command room. The officers began to murmur, unsure of what they were seeing. What is happening? One of them asked, voice thick with disbelief. Admiral Drak turned to his screens, watching in growing confusion. The ship, now impossibly close to their flagship, hadn't fired a single weapon. There was no sign of aggression, no missile launches, no laser beams cutting through the darkness. The ship was the weapon. It wasn't fighting the fleet in the way they expected, it was war itself. Without a sound, the first of the Imperial ships simply disappeared. The large, formidable vessels, once symbols of invincibility, vanished into nothingness. No explosion. No wreckage. Just empty space where they had once been. It was as though the very fabric of the universe itself had reached out and wiped them away, erasing them from existence. The silence in the command room was deafening. Panic swept through the officers as they looked at the empty spots on their screens, their faces paling. One by one, the Imperial ships disappeared, not destroyed but unmade, as though reality itself bent and twisted, erasing their existence without a trace. It wasn't a weapon they could understand. It wasn't a weapon at all, it was a force, something beyond the grasp of the Empire, something that rewrote reality. Impossible, Admiral Drac muttered, his voice hollow. His eyes darted across the room as his crews scrambled, trying to comprehend what was happening. The chaos was spreading like wildfire, officers shouting, technicians frantically trying to analyze the situation. But nothing made sense. The flagship trembled. "No debris," one of the officers whispered, wide-eyed. "No wreckage. No survivors." The human ship, the lone vessel that had defied their expectations, continued its relentless path toward the heart of the Imperial fleet. Its presence was a shadow in the darkness, a beacon of defiance. And then, as if sensing their panic, it slowed, coming to a halt, perfectly still in the void of space. The Imperial fleet, now reduced to a handful of crippled ships, was paralyzed in shock. The fleet that had boasted of its invincibility, its power, its endless strength, was gone. Erased. And with a final, chilling message, the ship's transmission echoed across the remains of the fleet, its words clear and cold. "The war is over." The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time in the history of the Imperial conquerors, they had encountered something far beyond their comprehension, something that had crushed their empire with a mere whisper. And they could do nothing to stop it. The vast emptiness of space had never felt so suffocating. Where once there had been 50,000 Imperial ships, now there was only silence, a vast, cold void where the fleet had once stood, like a dream fading into the darkness. No explosions, no sparks of destruction, just nothing. The fleet was gone. Erased. Not a single scrap of debris remained to mark its passing. It was as if the entire armada had simply ceased to exist. The remaining ships of the Empire lingered in this eerie quiet, floating in a space that felt suddenly vast and unfathomable. The Emperor's command room was thick with tension, the weight of what had just occurred pressing down on every officer in the room. A sense of dread crawled up their spines, a gnawing unease that threatened to crack their composure. Emperor Vorex, who had once stood with the confidence of an untouchable god, now felt the cold grip of fear clutching his heart. His towering form was still, his eyes fixed on the empty space where his fleet had once been. His mind, usually sharp and calculating, struggled to comprehend what had just happened. He had witnessed countless victories, watched as entire worlds fell before his might, but nothing had ever prepared him for this. Around him, his most trusted advisors scrambled. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had never seen fear on the Emperor's face, but now, it was there, hidden behind a veil of uncertainty. Lord Dranik Frosk, one of the most battle-hardened warlords in the Empire, was the first to speak, his voice wavering, betraying the terror he felt deep inside. "What happened to our fleet?" he asked, his words heavy, almost pleading. The question echoed in the room, but no one could answer. "They didn't fight us. They unmade us." The room fell into a stunned silence, the truth of his words settling like a weight on their chests. There were no great battles, no fierce resistance, just emptiness. The Imperial fleet, once the largest and most powerful force in the galaxy, had been wiped away in an instant. Not a single ship remained. No flames, no wreckage, no bodies floating in the void. Just an unbroken silence. The Emperor's gaze shifted to Zarin Althar, his chief intelligence officer. Zarin's normally calculating eyes were wide, his sharp features drawn in deep thought. He had always been the one to find answers in the chaos of war, but now, even his mind seemed to falter. He spoke slowly, as if testing the words in his mind before allowing them to leave his lips. It wasn't a weapon we know. His voice was quiet, filled with an unsettling sense of realization. It was something else, something beyond our understanding. The words hung in the air, more chilling than any weapon, more frightening than any enemy. The truth that no one had dared to acknowledge before now was slowly creeping into their consciousness. They had faced something that could not be defeated by their might, something that defied everything they had ever known about power and control. The Emperor's mind raced, but it couldn't keep up with the pace of the reality unfolding around him. He had believed that the Empire was invincible, that they were the undisputed rulers of the galaxy. But now they had encountered something that could unravel them with a mere flicker of its power. Something that had erased 50,000 ships from existence without a trace. The room was thick with uncertainty. Lord Frost paced in circles, his eyes darting between his fellow officers, as if searching for anyone to provide an explanation. But none came. His steps echoed through the room, breaking the silence with a sound that only emphasized the emptiness around them. One of the junior officers, trembling, approached Zarin. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice shaking. "We have no fleet. The Emperor, we have nothing." Zarin turned to face him, his expression grim, his mind grappling with the sheer impossibility of what had just transpired. He wanted to say something, anything to calm the growing panic in the room. But there were no words, only the truth. The Empire, for the first time in its history, had met its match. The Emperor stood in the center of the room, frozen, his mind a swirl of fear and disbelief. He had sent his fleet to crush humanity, to bring the last defiant species to its knees. And yet, in an instant, his empire had been undone. His ships, his warriors, his entire legacy gone. Zarin's voice broke through the suffocating silence again. "We cannot fight what we do not understand." His voice was hollow, resigned to the terrible truth. "Whatever it was that destroyed our fleet, we are powerless against it." The Emperor's eyes narrowed, but there was no anger in them, only a hollow, aching realization. The conquerors were no longer conquerors. They had become prey. The questions piled up in the air like smoke, thick and impenetrable. What had happened? How had this force done what no one else could? And most terrifying of all, who or what had done this? As panic spread through the room, the Emperor turned to his chief advisor, his voice cold, filled with authority, but also with a weight of uncertainty. "What is it that we are facing, Zarin?" he asked, his voice shaking, but trying desperately to maintain his composure. "And where is it now?" But Zarin had no answers, only a chilling silence that filled the room. The vast expanse of the galaxy seemed to stretch endlessly, but the weight of silence in the Imperial command room felt unbearable. The once mighty Imperial Empire, its walls built on centuries of dominance and fear, now stood at the precipice of something it could not comprehend. The Emperor, once the symbol of invincibility, now felt a heavy weight press upon his chest. The crushing blow of their defeat still echoed through the cold, empty spaces where their fleet had once stood. There was no celebration of victory, no exhilaration for what was supposed to be another conquest. Instead, the room hummed with a murmur of fear that rippled through every officer, every commander, every officer who had stood with pride at the helm of their mighty ships. They had lost. They had been defeated in a way that defied all their understanding of power and control. Emperor Vorex stood tall but felt as though the ground beneath him had crumbled. His eyes, once full of certainty, now wandered over the silent, anxious faces of his advisors. They had lost something precious, something they couldn't regain. Who had done this? Why were they now powerless? The debate was a frantic one. The officers discussed their next move, but the words they spoke felt hollow, empty in the face of the unknown. Could they recover? Could they retaliate against a force they had no concept of? Could they erase the stain of their failure? These questions hung in the air like a thick fog, and none had an answer. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Vorex issued a message, his voice cold and sharp. His words, though filled with the strength of a ruler who had always been obeyed, trembled in the very air they filled. "We send our warning," he said, the words heavy with his remaining authority. "Just one ship was enough. Do not make us send another." For a brief moment, there was an oppressive silence, as if the entire galaxy held its breath. The response, when it came, was not what they had expected. There was no pleading, no desperate response, no sound of fear or regret. Instead, a single, simple transmission flooded the Imperial channels, repeating itself over and over like a relentless whisper that couldn't be ignored. "Still watching." Those two words, spoken with such chilling finality, sent a wave of cold dread through the entire Empire. It was not a threat, it was a statement. A reminder. And in those two words, the Empire felt the crushing weight of something far beyond their reach. The room fell deathly silent. Admiral Drac, usually unshakable, now stood frozen, his mouth dry, his mind racing with confusion. His thoughts struggled to keep up with the enormity of what they were facing. Lord Dranik Frosk's face, usually hard and resolute, was now drawn tight with unease. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white, as the cold fingers of fear tightened around his heart. He could feel it. In every breath something was watching them, and it wasn't something they could control. The fear spread like wildfire across the Empire. It started as a whisper, then quickly grew into a tremor that ran through every corner of their vast territory. A single ship had destroyed their entire fleet without a trace. It had erased them from existence. Now, there was a new message. Still watching. Not one of anger, not one of revenge, but of something far colder. Something that didn't need to act in the way they understood. For the first time in millennia, the Imperial Empire felt vulnerable. The once unshakable foundations of their rule, built on violence and control, began to crack. Emperor Vorex, the very embodiment of the Empire's strength, now stood alone in the face of something far greater than himself. Something that could not be fought with weapons or fleets. His mind, usually sharp and calculating, now struggled to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. The room, once filled with confident officers and commanders, was now full of silent, trembling figures. Zarin Alhar, the Emperor's chief intelligence officer, stood off to the side, his eyes dark with dread. His mind, usually able to calculate every possible scenario, was now full of questions he couldn't answer. "What is it we are dealing with?" he muttered under his breath, though no one was really listening. "What force has the power to do this?" The answers didn't come. There was only that message, haunting them, echoing in their minds. Still watching. Fear. It spread across the galaxy, creeping into the very heart of the Empire. For the first time, the Empire realized they were no longer the apex predators of the universe. They were the prey. The Emperor's gaze grew distant as his thoughts spiraled inward. The once unchallenged ruler of the stars, who had crushed thousands of civilizations, now found himself paralyzed by something he couldn't comprehend. There were no weapons, no armies, no tactics that could defeat what had defeated them. The very idea of being vulnerable, of being watched by something unknown, something beyond their understanding, was enough to turn the mighty empire into a shadow of itself. The chilling realization settled over the Imperial Empire like a dark cloud, and with it came a new kind of fear. Fear not of death, but of the unknown, something that was beyond their control, beyond their comprehension. Something that had rendered them powerless, no matter how vast their fleets were or how mighty their empire had become. Still watching. Those words would haunt the empire forever. The once unshakable confidence of the imperial empire had been shattered. What had seemed like an insurmountable victory was now unraveling at the seams, leaving only confusion and dread in its wake. The empire's brightest minds, its most gifted scientists, its sharpest strategists had gathered in a dimly lit chamber, their faces taut with the pressure of the unknown. They were tasked with unraveling the mystery of the human ship, to make sense of what had happened, to understand how their fleet had been reduced to nothing, without a single shot fired or a single explosion to mark the end. The room was thick with a tense, almost suffocating silence. The data displayed before them on holographic screens flickered and flashed, presenting one unexplainable result after another. Calculations, numbers, and patterns swirled in the air, all of it meticulously laid out. Yet, despite all their collective intellect, none of it made sense. For hours, the scientists and strategists pored over the footage, analyzing every fragment of information that had been gathered. They reviewed the energy signatures, the sensor data, every piece of evidence they could find. But with each passing moment, their confidence waned. There were no weapons, no energy discharges, no signs of any conventional attack. The human ship had not fired a single projectile or launched a single missile. It didn't even seem to have a weapon at all. Instead, there was only silence, no energy spikes, no shifting of gravitational forces. It was as if the ship had moved through the fleet, untouched, as if nothing had happened at all, except that the entire Imperial fleet had simply ceased to exist. There were no physical markers left behind. Not even a trace of debris. And yet, the ships were gone. Dr. Calix Torth, one of the Empire's most respected and brilliant minds, stared at the data, his mind racing to make sense of it all. His hands shook slightly as he traced the lines on the screen, as though by doing so, he could unlock the secrets held within. There was no rational explanation, no way to reconcile the sheer power of the human ship with the absence of any observable action. How could something this impossible happen? How could the laws of nature be violated so effortlessly? His voice, usually calm and measured, trembled as he spoke. Perhaps the humans know something we don't, something older? The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room fell silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. Something older, he had said, and though the phrase seemed almost absurd, it echoed with a strange, unsettling truth. The very idea that humanity, a species so primitive compared to the vastness of the Empire, could possess knowledge that outstripped even their most advanced technology, was terrifying. The idea that something outside of their understanding had intervened, that reality itself had been altered in a way that the Empire could not begin to comprehend, sent a chill through the room. One of the other scientists, Joran Vex, ran his hand through his hair, frustration mounting on his face. What do you mean by older? What does that even mean? He scoffed, his voice rising in disbelief. Are we supposed to believe that the humans somehow unlocked a form of technology that bends the laws of physics? There's no record, no sign of such technology in any known galaxy. Dr. Torth, his gaze still fixed on the data, didn't flinch at the outburst. He simply stood there, his mind processing the implications of his own words. There was no easy answer, no neat explanation that could be pulled from the archives. The human ship had defied logic, its actions bypassing everything they thought they knew about science, about reality. He swallowed hard before continuing, his voice low but unwavering. What if it's not about technology at all? His eyes darted to the other scientists, who leaned in, their curiosity piqued by the uncertainty in his tone. What if the humans possess something beyond technology, something that interacts with the very fabric of space itself? The room grew still again, the weight of his words settling like a stone in the air. No one spoke. There were no answers, only questions that led to more questions. What did he mean? What could he possibly be suggesting? Commander Zellenrass, who had been listening quietly from the back of the room, stepped forward, her sharp eyes narrowing. So, are you suggesting they manipulate reality itself? That they can bend space to their will? Her voice was a mix of awe and terror, the idea of such power both fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. Dr. Torth met her gaze, his face pale. We don't know. But the evidence doesn't lie. We saw it with our own eyes. That ship didn't just fight us, it rewrote the very rules of the universe. He paused, a flicker of unease crossing his features. What if the humans have access to something we can't even begin to understand? Something older than all our science. The words older than all our science rang out in the silence, and each person in the room felt a shudder crawl up their spine. Something older. Something they had no name for, no category to place it in. It was a concept so vast and incomprehensible that even the Empire's brightest minds could not fathom it. For the first time, they realized that this was not just a battle of power, of might, it was a battle of something far deeper, something that could not be conquered by weapons or fleets. This was something beyond the Empire's reach, something they could not control. The human ship, and whatever force lay behind it, had shown them just how fragile their empire truly was. And as the scientists continued to search for answers, the room filled with a quiet, growing certainty that the Empire was facing something they could not defeat. Something far older, far deeper, and far more mysterious than they could ever comprehend. Emperor Vorex stood at the helm of his command ship, the weight of the galaxy pressing down on him. The once unshakable ruler of the Imperial Empire, a being whose will had crushed hundreds of worlds, now found himself trembling at the unknown. His thoughts raced, a storm of confusion and desperation swirling inside his mind. They had been defeated utterly and without explanation, and he had no answers. The questions gnawed at him. How could the humans do this? What power had they unleashed upon his fleet? In a final, desperate bid to regain control, Vorex made a decision that no ruler of the Empire had ever had to make. He would send a fleet again. This time, however, it would not be a fleet of tens of thousands. The Emperor, calculating, chose only 1,000 ships, still formidable, but smaller, more manageable. He would confront this mystery head-on, show the galaxy that the Empire's might had not been broken. He would see the humans crushed beneath his boot. The fleet, dark and foreboding, slipped silently through the expanse of space, making its way to the coordinates the humans had given. A desolate corner of the galaxy, empty, lifeless. As the ships drifted deeper into the void, an unsettling sense of isolation crept over the command room. The stars that once seemed so vibrant and full of life now appeared distant, cold, as though they too had grown distant from the Empire's reach. There was nothing here, no worlds, no moons, not even the faintest trace of life. For a long while, the fleet moved in eerie silence, their massive engines humming steadily in the void, cutting through the empty space like phantoms of a forgotten age. The officers in the command room watched the view screens, their eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of movement, any signal, anything to suggest that they weren't alone in this vast emptiness. But there was nothing. And then, just as the last shred of their confidence began to wear thin, something began to stir in the dark. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a slight disturbance that none could explain. No sound, no motion, just a presence. It was almost like the fabric of the universe itself had been stretched and pulled. The emptiness felt alive in a way they could not comprehend. A tremor ran through the fleet, a ripple of uncertainty that spread from ship to ship. A strange feeling crept over the crew, an instinctive dread that crawled up their spines. They began to exchange uneasy glances. It was as though something was watching them, moving in the darkness, but just beyond their reach. Suddenly, without warning, the first ship disappeared. At first, it seemed like a glitch, just a flicker on the screen, a momentary loss of signal. But then, another ship vanished. And then another. It was happening too quickly to process, too rapidly for any of them to react. The Imperial fleet was dissolving before their eyes. Ships that had once filled the void, mighty and indomitable, were simply gone. Not destroyed. Not shattered by any weapon. No explosions. No debris. They didn't break apart. They didn't burn. They simply vanished as if the universe itself had erased them from existence. No trace of them remained, not even the faintest whisper of their passing. The ships disappeared as though they had never been there at all, leaving behind only an empty, yawning void where they had once been. The officers stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests. The command room, once filled with the sound of voices and orders, was now suffocatingly silent. The steady hum of the ship's engines seemed to fade, drowned out by the rising panic in their minds. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it spread. One by one, the ships continued to disappear, vanishing as if some unseen force was systematically wiping them from existence. There were no weapons, no attacks, no sign of anything that could explain what was happening. It was as if the very fabric of reality itself was bending, distorting, rewriting the presence of the Imperial fleet. Admiral Karandrak, the steady leader of the fleet, who had stood in the face of countless battles without fear, now stood paralyzed. His voice, when he finally found it, was a whisper of disbelief. What is happening? His eyes darted over the displays, his hands shaking as he tried to process the impossibility of what he was seeing. Lord Dranik Frosk, the battle-hardened warlord, clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His face twisted in frustration, then fear. "This is no weapon we know," he muttered, the words barely a breath. "This is something else." The ships continued to disappear, one after another, swallowed by the nothingness, leaving behind an empty, haunting silence. The last of the Imperial fleet, the few remaining ships, turned in a futile retreat, engines roaring to life as they attempted to escape the invisible force that was erasing them. But it was too late. Even as they tried to flee, the ships began to flicker and fade, as though space itself was rejecting their presence. Emperor Vorex, who had been watching from his command ship, stood motionless, his mind racing with terror. His empire, his entire existence was unraveling before him. He had sent this fleet to regain control, to prove that the empire was unbreakable. And yet, in the face of this strange, unseen force, it had been reduced to nothing. For the first time, the emperor felt the crushing weight of helplessness. His fleet, the pride of the empire, was being swallowed by the void, and he had no answer, no power to stop it. And in the eerie silence that followed, there was only one question left: what had done this? What force could move through the galaxy with such ease, erasing the might of the empire without a single shot fired? And most terrifying of all, who was watching? The Imperial capital was silent, almost suffocatingly so. The great halls that once rang with the footsteps of victorious generals and the triumphant proclamations of the empire now seemed eerily still. Emperor Vorex, the ruler who had commanded countless victories, stood alone in the dim light of his command center. His face, usually filled with the hard edge of unyielding authority, was now twisted in disbelief. His hands, once steady as the foundation of the empire itself, trembled as they gripped the console before him. The screen flickered in front of him, the only light in the otherwise darkened room. The once proud fleet, the lifeblood of his power, had been wiped away. The pride of the Empire gone. No explosions, no heroic last stands, no smoldering wreckage. Just an empty void. The display now showed only one final message, repeating itself again and again, like a whisper in the vast expanse of space. Final warning. The words echoed in his mind, a cold, terrifying refrain that sent a chill through his bones. His breath hitched, the air around him suddenly too thick to breathe. The message was simple, direct, but it carried with it a weight that threatened to crush him. He read it again, his eyes fixated on those two words, as if hoping they would change, as if hoping that this nightmare was some cruel trick. But they didn't change. Final warning. For the first time in his life, Vorex felt a sensation he could not identify. It was not anger, not fear, but something far worse, helplessness. A feeling of being utterly powerless, something the Emperor of the Imperial Empire had never known. The walls that had stood tall around him, the shield of invincibility that had surrounded the Empire for centuries, had crumbled in an instant. And now, with that single message, all the power he had held, all the dominion over the galaxy, seemed like a distant memory, an illusion shattered by a force he could neither comprehend nor confront. The Empire, once the undisputed rulers of the galaxy, had been humbled. The Emperor's mind, once sharp and calculating, was clouded with disbelief. How could this happen? How could a single ship, a force so small in comparison to his mighty fleet, bring the Empire to its knees? He had believed his power was unchallenged, that no force could stand against the might of his fleets. But now, as he stared at the screen, all of that arrogance seemed so fragile, so meaningless. His hands trembled uncontrollably, a stark contrast to the calm demeanor he had always maintained. He reached for a glass of water, but his fingers, numb from the weight of the realization, knocked it over. The liquid spilled across the table, but he didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on the screen, still reading those same two words. Final warning. In the silence that followed, Vorex felt something deep within him shift. The familiar sense of control, of being the unchallenged ruler of the stars, slipped away like sand through his fingers. He had encountered many enemies, crushed countless civilizations beneath the weight of his will, but this was different. He had faced a force that didn't just defeat him, it had undone him, erased his very existence from the galaxy in an instant. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of fear. Not the fear of battle or the fear of losing power, but the fear of the unknown. What was this force? Who or what had the ability to erase entire fleets with nothing more than a flicker of energy? What had he truly been fighting against? His thoughts spiraled, but the answer eluded him. The Empire had always relied on its superior technology, its overwhelming numbers, and its sheer might to maintain control. But now, in the face of this mysterious force, all of it seemed so insignificant. The Emperor slowly turned away from the screen, his face pale, his mind numb. He tried to steady himself, to regain some semblance of the power he once held, but it was futile. The truth was inescapable. The Empire, for the first time in its existence, had met its match. Not in a weapon, not in a fleet, but in something so vast, so mysterious, that even the greatest minds of the Empire could not begin to understand it. And in that moment, Vorex understood that the Empire was no longer the apex of the galaxy. They were no longer the hunters. They had become the hunted. As the silence pressed in on him, the cold realization settled deeper into his bones. His rule, his entire existence had been undone by something beyond his reach. Something that had watched them. Something that could make them disappear in the blink of an eye. And now, that same something had delivered its final warning. He was no longer the ruler of the galaxy. He was simply a survivor, standing in the remnants of an empire that had once believed itself invincible. The Imperial Empire was reeling, its once unshakable might shattered by the inexplicable disappearance of its fleet. The warlords, commanders, and strategists had gathered in the cold, sterile chambers of the capital, their faces twisted with frustration and fear. Their grand, indomitable forces had been erased in an instant, and they had no answers. The humans, whom they had underestimated, had not fought them with advanced weapons or strange technology. No missiles, no laser beams, no grand, destructive force. There had been nothing to explain it until now. In the heart of the Empire, Dr. Calix Torth, one of the brightest minds in Imperial science, had been working tirelessly, analyzing every scrap of data, every transmission, every shred of evidence that had been recovered. His brow furrowed in deep concentration as he sifted through the results, his fingers trembling as they traced the lines of analysis on the glowing screen before him. His mind, once calm and calculating, had been thrown into a state of unease as he unraveled the facts, piece by piece. The humans had not fought the Empire. They had not unleashed some unimaginable weapon. No energy spikes, no weapon signatures. Their ships had not attacked, not in any conventional sense. It was as if the entire Imperial fleet had simply vanished, as if the laws of the universe had been bent, rewritten, erased. The truth, as it slowly unfolded before Dr. Torth, was chilling. The humans had never been the true cause of the Empire's downfall. It wasn't their weapons or technology that had destroyed the fleet. No, something much older, something beyond the comprehension of even the brightest minds in the Empire, had intervened. It had protected the humans, guarding them from the Empire's wrath in a way that defied all logic. And, perhaps most terrifying of all, it had done so without the Empire even realizing. Dr. Torth sat back in his chair, his mind spinning as the implications of this new knowledge crashed over him. This was no ordinary enemy. This was a force beyond their reach, beyond even their understanding of reality. It was not bound by the laws of physics as the Empire knew them. It was a force older than the Empire itself, older than any of the civilizations they had conquered. And it had chosen to act on behalf of the humans. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The Empire, in its arrogance and confidence, had been warned off. The humans had not been the true source of the power that had wiped out the fleet. The humans were merely the chosen ones, the ones protected by something far more powerful, something that had seen through the veil of time and space to stop the Empire's advance. He stood up, his heart racing, his mind struggling to come to terms with the enormity of what he had uncovered. He had thought the humans were simply a primitive race, weak, vulnerable, insignificant. But now, it was clear that they were under the protection of a force far beyond the Empire's wildest imagination. His voice was barely a whisper, but the words he spoke were enough to send a ripple of fear through the room. It wasn't them. The humans, they didn't do this. Something else did. A chill ran down the spines of everyone present. The thought of facing an enemy that wasn't bound by their understanding of the universe, that could rewrite reality itself, was enough to make even the most hardened warriors tremble. The mystery of the humans had deepened into something far darker, far more unsettling. For the first time in history, the Imperial Empire had encountered a force stronger than itself. And it was not something they could fight or conquer. It was not something they could even comprehend. Dr. Torth turned, his face pale as he looked toward Emperor Vorex, who stood in the center of the room, his regal presence now weighed down by a terrifying new reality. The Empire has been warned off, Dr. Torth continued, his voice tinged with awe and fear. By something we can't even begin to understand. This power has chosen the humans. We've been unmade. The Emperor's eyes flickered, a glimmer of fear creeping into his gaze. For the first time in his life, Vorex felt the crushing weight of what it meant to be truly vulnerable, to be the hunted, not the hunter. He had built his empire on the belief that nothing could touch him, that his fleets were invincible. But now, in the face of something older, something more powerful than even the greatest minds of the empire, he realized how fragile that belief had been. The realization spread through the room like wildfire. They were not facing a rival species. They were facing a force that existed outside the boundaries of their understanding, a force that had not just defeated them, it had chosen to act, chosen to protect the humans, and in doing so, had dismantled everything the Empire had worked for. The Empire, once the most powerful force in the galaxy, was now a shadow of its former self. The humans, once seen as insignificant, now stood as something far more important than they had ever known, protected by a power that no one, not even the mighty Emperor Vorex, could challenge. And as the Empire's brightest minds continued to search for answers, the truth loomed over them like a storm. They were not the rulers of the galaxy anymore. The humans were under the protection of something that could erase them without even lifting a finger. And that something was watching. The aftermath of the Empire's defeat left a darkness that stretched far beyond the shattered remains of their once mighty fleet. Emperor Vorex, who had ruled with the iron grip of absolute power, now found himself seated in a throne of crumbling stone, his empire no longer the vast, invincible force it had once been. The grandeur, the pride, the unspoken confidence that had come with being the most powerful force in the galaxy, these things were gone. In their place was a chilling void of uncertainty and fear. The Imperial Empire withdrew, retreating behind its borders as if trying to hide from the very galaxy it had once dominated. It was a quiet surrender, one that echoed in the empty halls of the capital, where officers, warlords, and commanders moved like shadows, their steps uncertain, their voices lacking the confidence they once had. There would be no more conquests. No more worlds to claim. The mighty fleet that had once surged through the stars was gone, erased, and with it, any hope of reclaiming their dominance. Fear settled over the galaxy like a thick fog. Whispers spread like wildfire, rumors of what had happened. Of the humans once seen as nothing more than a fragile, primitive race, now the source of an undeniable terror. Some said the humans themselves had done this, that their strange, unknown technology was the key to their victory. Others whispered something more ancient, more terrifying. They spoke of a force, older than the Empire, that watched over the humans, protecting them, and destroying anyone who dared to threaten them. No one knew the truth, but the fear was the same. The Empire, once an unstoppable juggernaut, had been humbled in a way that shattered their self-image. They had been unmade by something they couldn't understand, something that had wiped away their might with a mere flicker. Something out there. And so, the Empire became a shadow of its former self. It remained powerful, yes, but its once unquestionable supremacy was gone. The fear of the unknown hung over every decision, every action. The great empire was no longer the predator, it was the prey. The galaxy, once cowering beneath their rule, now whispered of something else, something darker, something unseen. The galaxy shifted. The empire may have retreated, but the human force continued to spread, unknowingly shielded by something far beyond their understanding. The once feared empire's influence waned, and in the darkest corners of space, those places where no empire dared tread, something stirred once more. In the silent stretches between the stars, where even the most daring explorers feared to venture, something ancient, something primal, began to awaken. The mystery that had once brought the empire to its knees was far from over. The force that had protected the humans, that had wiped away fleets without a trace, was not done. And perhaps, just perhaps, It was waiting for the right moment to act again.